Welcome, everyone. I'm Nahid Khan, the Communications and Marketing Specialist at the Immigrant Women's Information Network. On behalf of the iWin team and staff, welcome to today's webinar, Beyond Language Access, Creating Culturally Responsive Services for GBV Programming. As we gather in this virtual space, we begin by acknowledging that we are meeting on lands that have been long home to Indigenous nations across Turtle Island. I am located on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, and the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. I also acknowledge that many of you are joining from different territories, each with its own histories, treaties, and responsibilities. At iWin, we are committed to creating spaces that center Indigenous voices, languages, and worldviews. We recognize that reconciliation is not a single act, but an ongoing process, one that requires us to challenge colonial systems of exclusion, address anti-Indigenous racism, and amplify Indigenous-led movements for justice, healing, and language revitalization. As we explore what it means to move beyond language access, let us also reflect on how colonialism has shaped the languages we speak, the stories we tell, and the way immigrant and newcomer communities come to understand Indigenous histories and rights. May this webinar serve as both a conversation and commitment to deepen our collective responsibility to truth, justice, and relationship building with Indigenous peoples through the power of language, listening, and care. I'm so pleased to introduce our speakers for today's webinars. Our first speaker is Dr. Selina Abji, a sociologist with over 20 years of experience in social justice research, education, and evaluation. Her work examines the politics of immigration and gender-based violence in Canada, and she's published widely on these issues. She also has worked closely with community networks like the Rights of Non-Status Women Network to advocate for systemic change and better support for women with precarious immigration status. Next, we have Dr. Deepa Mathu, Executive Director of the Barbara Schleifer Commemorative Clinic. Dr. Mathu is a human rights lawyer and educator who has led national efforts to advance gender equity, language justice, and survivor-centered legal and counseling services. And finally, Dr. Rupalim Bhuya, professor at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Social Work. Her research and advocacy focus on immigration, gender-based violence, and anti-racist social network practice. Through her work, she continues to bridge research, policy, and community-based programming to create more equitable systems of support for immigrant and refugee women. We're truly honored to have all these three speakers with us today, and I'm looking forward to their insights and discussions. As each presentation is being delivered, we kindly ask all attendees to type your questions in the Q&A box. We will spend the final 15 minutes addressing your questions during the Q&A session. Selina, we will now turn the presentation over to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Nahid. It's such an honor to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And I'm so excited just to be sharing space with some of my brilliant and lovely colleagues. And it's Friday, so what a great combination of things. I wanted to start just first by situating myself. I know you heard the bio, the official bio, but I wanted to situate myself in relation to the topic that we're discussing today around culturally responsive GBV services. Zainab, if you don't mind, next slide. So I've got a couple of photographs that I'm sharing with you today. On the left, you can see that's me in the little blue jumper with my mother and maternal grandfather sitting outside the little bungalow in North Etobicoke where I grew up in Rexdale in Toronto, for those of you who are familiar. I'm what they call a second generation immigrant, South Asian, Muslim, part of the Indian diaspora, who for multiple generations lived in East Africa and specifically Tanzania. And we were among the first in our family to immigrate to Canada. We lived by the airport, and so the joke has always been that our house that we grew up in was one of the original settlement houses for our community. And I raise this as, an entry point for myself because I've come to see how a lot of what I observed as a child really informs my scholarship and my activism, and the important role of community and culture in helping people navigate their life in Canada, whether they chose that life or not. Um, and so, fast forward 2024, a lot of us on this panel have been involved with the Rights of Non-Status Women Network, all of us, I should say. And a lot of what we witnessed in the post 9/11 period, for me particularly, has shaped my activism. I've listed some of these things there. Really witnessing securitization of Canada's borders, a real clamping down on access to citizenship, particularly in those decades following 9/11 and under Prime Minister Stephen Harper, but not exclusively so. We're seeing some of that happening right now in Canada's relationship to our neighbor to the south. Um, and at the same time, also seeing a lot of really great activism and work happening in social movements and NGOs to really push back and uplift human rights and the rights of survivors of gender-based violence for safety and protection. And I kind of fell into the work of culture and gender-based violence almost by accident on the sidelines, got involved in some research looking at South Asian communities and some of the work happening around GBV in that area. That's where I met Deepa on our panel, Deepa Matu, and some of that work. We were seeing some really high-profile cases of murders of South Asian women like Aksa Parvez and the Shafia family murders. Um, and there was a real move within those communities to challenge the cultural stigmatization of those communities, while at the same time drawing attention to the real failure of our systems to protect or prevent gender-based violence among those communities. So this was all kind of happening for me in the context of some of the kind of broader work that I was looking at around critical migration studies. And so for today, next slide, please. I was thinking about what I want to share today, and there are really three interventions that I humbly want to offer to start this conversation. And one is whenever we talk about culturally responsive or culturally safe approaches to gender-based violence, I'd like us to pause first and say, wait, what is culture anyways? Like, what do we mean by it? What is its relationship to gender-based violence? And then I think, secondly, it's important for us to then zoom out and really look critically at how culture really has been weaponized, not only in Canada, but also more broadly, to further specific state power and political agendas. And then, given all of this context, I'd like to offer some suggestions around what does that mean for GBV service provision, like in the where, the when, and the how we talk about culture in that context. Um, and this comes largely from the wisdom and learnings of activists and NGOs navigating racism, cultural stigmatization, and a scaling back of citizenship and rights that we're seeing across Western nations in the 21st century. And so let's start with that first intervention. What is culture? And we have on this slide a picture of our fish who's swimming in water, but not always aware. I think culture is really something that we take for granted. It's something that is everywhere and shapes everything, whether we're conscious of it or not. And so, from a sociology perspective, often we define culture as things like beliefs, practices, values, and norms. And really, we use those things to make sense of our world more broadly. And so when we think about that fish, we want to think about our own relationship to culture. We're swimming in culture as well. It's not only something that is associated with those people over there who have culture. We always want to be mindful of the fact that we are all swimming in it. And as sociologists, we also often talk about how culture is really multifaceted. It's a complex phenomenon. On the one hand, culture is structural. So rather than thinking of it as something that exists in the abstract, we want to always remember that it is anchored in specific institutions like government, education, healthcare, policing. It's also anchored in everyday practices like how we dress, how we communicate, how we gather, how we resolve conflict. All of these things are anchorings of culture. Um, and also, at the same time, it's not only anchored in those systems, but it's also deeply personal. It's important, I think, to remember this when we're working with survivors as well, because as individuals, families, and communities, we have agency to choose or express our cultural beliefs or traditions. For many, it can be a source of safety, of belonging, of healing, of connection to our lineages, the land, and to each other. And then finally, we want to listen for moments when people describe culture as something that is static, that is unchanging, that doesn't have a history. And we want to challenge that because culture is very dynamic. It is something that is lived. It's a collection of practices that is always unfolding. And this can be a source of hope as well for us because we do have some agency and capacity to shape culture. And it's important to remember that as well. So it's all of those things at the same time. And so, given that, how does culture get weaponized? How does it get used, or how has it been used in the Canadian context? And I'll ask for the next slide, please. So I could have picked lots of examples, but I chose this one. It's something that I've written about as well in publications, and I'll share some links to those on the last slide. But you might recognize that picture on the top right. This is the government under Prime Minister Harper. It's Chris Alexander, the minister, who's talking there. And they introduced and passed a bill called Bill S7, the Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act, an act to amend the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, the Civil Marriage Act, the Criminal Code, and consequential amendments to other acts. That's the full name. And it's something that's called an omnibus bill. Like it included many, many different changes. And it came at a time when there were lots of changes happening to the immigration system as well. And so in some of my research, we go into a full analysis of that bill, and we'll link to it later. But for now, what I want to say is that there is a particular type of right-wing politics that has, on the one hand, deep roots in colonization, but it's also taken on a particular form in present day. And scholars like Shireen Razak and Mahmoud Mamdani have written about this as culture talk. And I really like this term culture talk because you can look and say, this is culture talk. This is an example of using culture to, like in laws and politics and discourse, to politicize it. It reinforces the idea that certain cultures are barbaric and in need of Western intervention. And it often will co-opt some of the work we're trying to do around gender-based violence in the interests of those racialized politics. So, for example, it will position racialized and immigrant men as more prone to violence, including gender-based violence. Or it will kind of slide under the rug some punitive immigration controls and criminalization of racialized communities in ways that, is meant to be shown as we are protecting, we're addressing gender-based violence by introducing these immigration controls and different measures. And I have that quote from Spivak there is like, oh, we're saving brown women from brown men, right? This like a justification for war, justification for neoliberal policies, and so on. And so I think that omnibus bill is something that we need to be aware of, that particularly that particular type of right-wing politics is something that we need to be aware of. And I love that kind of cheeky cartoon at the bottom right as well. Because what it's doing there, you've got the woman in niqab who's the conservatives also introduced a barbaric practices hotline. So this idea that you could call if you're seeing barbaric cultural practices, kind of a snitch line. And so you have the woman in niqab who is calling and telling on some of the policies as being barbaric. So the introduction of the ban on niqab during citizenship ceremonies, things like that. So I love that kind of flipping because it's showing, oh, well, this is also cultural. This, the Islamophobia as well is something that is an issue in Canadian society, and it's calling attention to that. I think I'll leave it there for that. And I think for the next slide, I think, we want to raise this issue because I think it's important whenever we're talking about culture to not let it be used as a way to distract us from the structural. We always want to be paying attention to that. And so I know some of my colleagues will may elaborate on this as well, but I think we always want to be paying attention to the ways in which precarious immigration status is connected to gender-based violence, that there is an intersection there that's very important for us to always be mindful of and to not be distracted from. And so very, very quickly, happy to elaborate on any of this, but we know that vulnerability to gender-based violence is really embedded in how our immigration system is organized. And a very quick example of that is how we embed a reliance on sponsors, whether it's an employer sponsor or a spouse, how that kind of power and control and opening for exploitation is embedded in how we even organize what it means to be in Canada and under whose authority. And then that also plays a role in individual relationships. We know that a common tactic of gender-based violence in intimate partner relationships could be threats of deportation. I'm going to call the snitch line. I'm going to call immigration authorities as used as a tactic. Um, and also, what I've shown in some of my own research and studied is how survivorship, the actual act of trying to survive or flee violence or seek protection, increasingly gets criminalized. So, that picture that you see on the left there, that is from a protest in honor of Lucia Vega Jimenez, who was a survivor fleeing violence in her home country of Mexico, who applied for refugee status and through various failures of our system ended up in immigration detention and unfortunately passed away in the detention center. And so in the research, I kind of show how even our very tactics of trying to survive gender-based violence are increasingly treated as flight risks or in punitive ways. And maybe let's move on to the next slide. And so a lot of context there. What does this mean at the end of the day for service provision? And so I want to offer humbly three strategies that I think from my vantage point as a sociologist and as a community-based researcher, we might want to think about as we are doing this very important work of providing safety and support for survivors. And the first is, I think we really need to embrace this understanding of culture as everywhere and take time as service providers and as NGOs to really think about what is the role of culture at multiple levels in my work, in my life. So for example, what are the contexts in our organization? What is the culture of our organization? What are some of our underlying assumptions about how we understand gender-based violence, how we even understand solutions or what freedom from violence looks like? How is culture impacting or shaping our own understandings? And to do that kind of rigorous, reflexive work. And an example of that, we know that even the language that we use to talk about violence has changed. Like there was a time where it was called wife battering, right? And we, over time, have really shown actually, it's in intimate partner relationships of all kinds, not only in marriage, that violence can occur. It's not only about physical violence, but it can take many different shapes. So our own understandings of violence themselves shift and change over time. And so we want to be reflexive about that. And then secondly, we want to practice talking about GBV in culturally nuanced ways. Whenever we can add that nuance, we really try hard to do that. And so, for example, instead of looking at certain forms of violence as, oh, that's culturally motivated. The shift is to say all violence has culture as a component. Culture affects all forms of violence. It also shapes all responses to violence. So our work is to interrogate what is the role of culture in those situations. Even saying, call the police, when someone comes and discloses violence to you, is a cultural response in a settler colonial society where we're primed to see the government as being our benevolent protector. So we want to try to unpack and interrogate how culture is shaping all of those things. And then finally, I talked about this a little bit before, but we don't want to use culture to distract from the structural. So a lot of times what the real issues are, the real root causes are systemic and structural. So we want to always be, when they try to distract us with the barbaric cultural practices hotline, we want to always bring the conversation back whenever we can to issues of poverty, discrimination, exploitation, and so on. And I think with that, we've got the slide deck. If you're interested in any of the research, I've tried to link some of the relevant papers there. And I don't know if the slides are going to be shared with our audience members, but it's there for you to use. And I will hand it back to our moderator.
Thank you so much, Selena. I definitely learned a lot from your presentation. It was very thought-provoking and a lot of questions that yet need to be answered, especially when it comes to um, our own reflections. But yes, pointing on what Selena had mentioned, the recording of this webinar will be shared on our website. So stay tuned for that when we have it uploaded. We will now turn the presentation to Deepa.
Thank you, Selena. That was such an amazing framing, and I really enjoyed it. A minor correction, I'm not a doctor yet. I'm in the company of doctors, but thank you for giving me that. Maybe I need to find a way to get that title without going through the process. But just using the humor to convey that, I'm not serious, so please do not take it such. So I will also start with locating myself. I work at Barbara Schweitzer Commemorative Clinic. So if I can get to the next slide. And the clinic has been in existence for 40 years. It's named after a woman, Barbara Tina Schleifer. She was a lawyer, and actually, unfortunately, on the night of her call to the bar, she lost her life to a brutal situation or an incident, I should say, of sexual assault and murder. Her death changed lives who were close to her, and they resolved to use her tragedy as a springboard for changing the world. So in September 1985, so this incident happened in 1980, and in September 1985, the clinic opened its door. And since then, an effort that was started as a small endeavor has now resulted in an organization which is multi-service. We provide services in legal, counseling, and interpretation as our three pillars, but we also work on multiple developmental projects, and the clinic has been providing services for sexual assault survivors now all across Ontario. We have some national projects, and we also have ECOSOC accreditation, which makes us have table on at some UN Civil Society meetings as well. We do a lot of law reform work. We do a lot of legal intervention work and broader advocacy to end gender-based violence. Going to the next slide very quickly, these are the missions of the organization. We are rooted in foundations of intersectionality, innovation, and client-centered approach, and we foster the skills and resilience of people we serve and amplify their voices to create individual and collective change. So the work that the clinic does supports a lot of system transformation, and we work with women and gender diverse people who have experienced violence. Moving on. Thank you. So I wanted to think about this issue from the perspective of how does gender-based violence, broadly speaking, impact people with precarious immigration status or non-status people, and then what is the location of a culturally responsive service? So start very quickly. If we think about folks who get displaced globally and are impacted by gender-based violence, some of the UNHCR stats tell us that around 60 million people forcibly are displaced or are stateless, who are stateless are either women and girls and are at risk or facing gender-based violence. This type of violence can include intimate partner violence, sexual harassment, and conflict-related sexual violence. And 72% of the countries where UNHCR has operations, you have GBV services available for survivors, which kind of speaks directly to how many spaces GBV interventions are needed or available. Moving on to the next slide, please. Here is some more stats for you for your reflection. And these are collected from various different studies and reports. So 70% of non-status women report difficulties in accessing healthcare. Only 30% of non-status women successfully access legal aid. 60% of racialized immigrant women are employed in precarious jobs. 50% of non-status women experience gender-based violence. 65% of non-status women report feeling socially isolated. 40% of non-status women face housing insecurity, and 55% of non-status women have unmet educational needs. So when it comes to, do we have a recognizable problem and do we understand the challenges, I think that's pretty clear and can be understood. The gender-based violence framework on the next slide kind of goes deeper into understanding how complex and layered the issue of gender-based violence is, and how it impacts people with, with the precarious immigration status. And I use that term very openly and broadly, but also impacts people who come from those communities and histories of migration. The challenge that from the service provision perspective is that services often remain rooted in framework that assumes a universal experience of violence and healing instead of that specific experience of violence and healing related to someone's identity, social location, their own histories, histories of colonial experiences, but also histories of experiencing criminal justice system, who gets more criminalized in the system and who gets less criminalized in the system, the broader xenophobia that communities experience. But we know that violence is not experienced equally. It is not, it's not an equal experience, and B, it is not experienced in the same way. So there is a unique experience of violence that happens for people based on their location and their access experience. So people's race, their status, their language, their disability, their sexual orientation, their gender identity, and so many more things which are given on this, this flower petal design that we have. This is one of the frameworks that we use in one of our projects called Risk Arise Above Risk. And it kind of speaks to the Kimberly Crenshaw's work around intersectionality, and speaks to how survivors' unique characteristics and identities play a very unique role in their experience of violence. Moving on to the next slide, please. So one thing which is really important to understand, that anytime we bring in the concept of culture, and we ask for a culturally responsive service, culturally sensitive, culturally humble service, we have to think about how, for some folks, it's beyond culture. It is their immigration status, it is their own experiences, and how the legal frameworks that are supposed to protect them can actually be the very cause of violence in their lives. And we find that a lot of survivors we work with here at the clinic, it's the very law of spousal sponsorship or common law partner sponsorship, the way it is designed, that they would choose to make decisions which are sometimes, full of risk, not safe, but they make those decisions because law has created a framework where they feel that they don't have any other option or choice. And layered with that, there are communication barriers. There is fear of deportation. There is fear of retaliation from the abuser, and not only to the person who's experiencing violence, but way beyond, right? So we see a lot of survivors who have their families living abroad, and then they are experiencing um, experiencing violence against their family members. There's also mistrust of the system and the fear of the police. And there is lack of acknowledgement of the resources, lack of knowledge resources, I'm sorry, for available to them. So a lot of services, and again, take a very universal stance. And in that universal stance, the services that and the knowledge resources that should be designed specifically for specific populations do not either exist, or they exist in a way which are not accessible to communities in many spaces. Moving on to the next. So model of service delivery. So I feel there are two things which, for any service design, that should be kept in mind if you are wanting to be culturally responsive. So there is no such thing as culture 101. So I don't believe in that kind of education. I don't believe that someone can actually go through a South Asian culture 101 kind of education and then become an expert in South Asian culture, because culture in itself, as Selena was explaining, it's a very fluid concept, and it evolves, it changes. And in a minute, I'll talk about the histories of migration, how that also many times would make our experiences very unique, even if we come from the same cultural box that is created, the tick boxes that are created for us. So thinking about that, all of that complexity in mind, it is important that service delivery recognizes that intersectionality is not just a buzzword, it's just not a framework that you talk about, it's the necessity of the work that you're doing. But then also understanding the nuance that intersectionality is an experience of violence, which is happening based on your identity, your social location, your experience of law, and so on and so forth. But it's actually systemic barriers that create those barriers, and those institutional barriers that create those barriers for people to access services. So I find a lot of confusion in design of services at times, where people think about, we will make our services intersectional, and which is great. You should have that framework, but we should also understand that it's not the fight is about the systemic discrimination. The fight is about the racism. The fight is about xenophobia. So I think in many situations, including the Barbaric Cultural Practices Act that Selena was talking about, many a times when when services have asked for resources for culturally responsive services or designing of services, that whole weaponizing of that notion has been done with this thought process that, oh, it's a problem within a community. When the reality is, what we should be talking about is that we need system enhancement and system improvement so that this colonial, racist, and xenophobic frameworks do not exist in our service delivery and broader policy development. Also, I think the second point that I want to emphasize on is that there's a need for ensuring that our programs are not only accessible, but also affirming, relevant, and empowering. So you don't go to the community and say, we are available, we provide services in these many languages. You actually provide those affirming, relevant, and empowering services and programs for the community to actually trust the spaces. So I believe that your allyship is not what you declare. Your allyship is what people see demonstrated in the work that you're doing. Next slide, please. There are a few things that I think I'm probably just repeating some of the stuff that Selena probably has already touched upon, that in service design, we need to think about. Cultural stigma is weaponized a lot of times against the community. So we need to be really, really careful about our designing. The migration histories means that our culture changes for same group of people, even with very similar identities. We might not be the same people, and those migration histories for diaspora means that we have very different needs, whether it is language need or whether it is the need to understand who I am. So that assumption that comes with cultural sensitivity at times can be a space for bias and discrimination, which needs to be understood, which needs to be unpacked or understood. Historical trauma, a lot of communities come with a lot of deep historical trauma of colonial histories, as well as oppression among the communities. We have a lot of historical trauma of within the same region of a lot of oppression within the communities that need to be understood. It is a very deep, nuanced work. A lot of work that we need to do is to make sure that we are centering on clients' experiencing. We are letting them be the experts and advise you, and let the clients make their decisions instead of imposing decisions on them. Trauma-informed approach and trauma and violence-informed approach is definitely something that you need to think about when you're doing your system design or your program design, and if you're wanting your agencies to be culturally sensitive and responsive. Your discretion will always be at play in most of these cases. When you are trying to do something, you will always try to make space for multiple people who will be coming to you for getting services. So you will, one of the simple example that I give is a lot of agencies, when they're on the journey of, rather than taking a universal stance, taking a culturally responsive stance, they will be like, oh, in our agency we have people who speak these 3 languages, or we have this one person who's indigenous, or we have this one person who is representing this one particular other group of people. And that those discretionary decisions that you're making in creating space for survivors as well as for your colleagues in the space, you have to be very, very careful how that impacts the relationships and also support structures for your clients as well as people who work with you. First impression makes a difference. Absolutely, it does. How you act, how you create a space which is welcoming, warm, affirmative, empowering. All of that starts from that first phone call someone makes, that first step that they make. They take to you. And remember, if you're talking about survivors of gender-based violence, you have a huge responsibility on your shoulders. You might be the only person who they have called after thinking about it for months and weeks. And so if you do not respond in the way that is respectful and helps them think about, this is not my last call, it all depends on you. So your responsibility is huge. So I really wanted to emphasize on that. Sometimes you are there's a one chance rule that you need to be thinking about in these situations. So precarious status can also be root cause of a lot of coercion, and then coercion and coercive control needs to be unpacked in these cases in your assessment and analysis, and you should have good frameworks of unpacking that. At the clinic, we obviously advocate a lot for a risk assessment and making an assessment of what kind of fear survivor is experiencing themselves and centering that as part of the response design. Going to the next slide, please. So what are some of the good practices or best practices that you can think about as you design your services and programs? You can co-create programs with communities at their sites. So I really am a big fan of this, where I feel like you need to understand where communities are and where they already have rapport built, they already have relationship built. And instead of wanting community to come to you, you co-create design programs and with the community where they are. So if you have an expertise that you think can benefit, and there is a gap that you are trying to fill, co-create those programs and those services. Embed cultural humanity and trauma-informed care in everything that you do. Again, it is not just a framework, it is a way of practice. You need to get training, you need to do a lot of refresher training, and you need to make it about everything, right from the intake to the program service design to the closing of the file. You have to think about everything. Recognize survivors as experts. I think I already mentioned that. And then hopefully that intersectional framework, which is not just a buzzword, is at every layer of service design, where you're thinking about a wraparound model for everything that you do with the clients. And where you need experts on specific issues, being humble and being open to working with those experts and understanding that you probably don't know everything, and which is fine as long as you're open to co-creating those programs and getting that expertise where it's needed. Moving to the next slide, please. So my last intervention before I wrap up is that survivors are not passive recipients, they're active agents of change, and their stories carry solutions and strategies as well as strength. So trust that you are working with the survivors who have been surviving this for years and sometimes intergenerationally for centuries. So you need to not be someone who's just trying to figure out a solution and give out a solution and be done with it. You need to work with your survivors, that they are the experts. They know what they have been doing and how they have been managing, and your role is to listen, learn, and adapt. Do not use a prescription model. Do not use a model of pathologizing. Do not use a model where you are scrutinizing. Make sure that you are providing a lot of dignity in the process. There is a lot of complexity in the system that folks who don't speak the language and who are new to the country, they have a lot of creativity and courage and care. I come from India. We have a whole theory of what we call jugaad, which means that that the creativity and innovation is at the peak of people's headspace when they are trying to navigate this complexity. So your services should reflect that complexity and honor that strength instead of viewing it as some kind of a deficiency. See their expertise as their expertise of strength, and try to learn from them. They have a lot to offer in terms of what you can do for your services and how you can design your services, which are most appropriate and respectful. So my last slide here is with a QR code. Okay, so that I think the survivor that okay. That slide is missing. So I had a slide here which is missing where I had a QR code to for you to learn more about it. But the clinic's website is www.barberschleiferclinic.com. You can also Google the clinic, and those were my interventions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deepa, for your powerful presentation. I really appreciated how you had unpacked the idea and actually brought up the idea of cultural stigma, which is something that's not really mentioned nowadays, and kind of shifted also the focus on legal and policy framework, and that sometimes is the reason as to why gender-based violence survivors are not allowed or not able to access meaningful support. So I think I've learned a lot from your presentation. So thank you. Rupalim, we would now like to invite you as we transition the presentation.
Ooh, my brain is full and spinning. I was like, I'll go third. And I was like, what was a terrible idea. Now I'm thinking. I hope everyone's doing well in your various places. I know it's going to be a long weekend. Hopefully you have refreshments nearby. I'm going to try to add a few more of that layers of complexity. And Deep, I want to learn this concept you shared, right? That when we are challenged, that's where our creativity and maybe even our possibility can come from. And I really think of it as like things that we didn't even know or couldn't have imagined. Maybe we can get there together. Um, so my name is Rupaline Bhuyan. I've had a pleasure of working with Selena and Deepa for several years. We were making beautiful trouble together with the Rights of Non-Status Women Network, really a space of advocacy and collective learning and sharing. And I really bring that spirit here to share some of the work I've been doing. I was thinking about how to add to the conversation on beyond language access. And I have always been kind of driven out of my own experience to think about at a very structural level, things that are often beyond our words. Or as this incredible Palestinian activist who I've recently got to know her work writes, pressurized words, right? Like how we are often pressured to use words that feel that they don't quite explain what we're going through, and how that when you add that interpretation piece be even harder. So no matter what language we speak in our homes, in our daily lives, or in our workplaces, um, the languages we have, the symbols, the understandings are often not enough, right? So I think going back to what Deepa was saying as a connection is rather than have a recipe of this is how I will operate, or I will translate all my forms into all these languages, the hundreds of languages that are in Toronto, which we know is not usually financially possible. How do we then create the spaces instead to make meaning together and create that space? Because often we don't understand, and people are also in the process of understanding what they're going through. Um, so I'll go through some of my slides in the time we have so we can have room for discussion and questions. So the topic here is intended to be provocative, maybe playful a little bit. I'm also South Asian. I'll say a little bit more about me. Very gratefully joining. Today, I'm actually in my cousin's home being an auntie, a full-time auntie. My cousin's sister, who I grew up with in the US, we're both from Assam. Our mothers were sisters, is traveling. She's getting her oldest child settled into university. So I'm kind of a full-time aunt now, taking care of her teenage child. Not really taking care, making sure they're doing their homework and sleeping and eating. They're 15, so they don't really need me. But yeah, I want you to think for a moment about what this title, how is it hitting you? Um, what roles in your lives may you be playing? Thinking specifically in your professional service volunteer roles, supporting folks experiencing gender-based violence, where you may be showing up as an auntie, or maybe you're showing up as a type of cop, right? Or maybe in what ways is that showing up also a type of border agent? Maybe that's not how you think about your work. So I'm going to invite you to think about this because we've been looking at the ways in which in the child welfare system, where many parents who are mostly identified as women are involved when they're experiencing gender-based violence, a huge number. So there are certainly cases where children and youth are at harm, they are being treated and need to have interventions of all sorts. The child welfare system was designed in part to protect children, but it has also often been a space where it's policed families who are different, whose culture or way of parenting is seen a threat. A threat to what, though? A threat to the child, a threat to society, a threat to assumptions about what is Canada and assimilation, what makes someone a good worker. So these are the questions around culture, which I think are at the heart of some of this responsiveness. What are our own conceptions of what's a good way to live, good way to parent, a good way to respond when you're experiencing different kinds of violence at an individual level, and a family level, at a structural level? So I'll move through a little bit to the next slide. As my entry point, yeah, I'll just say a little. I'm following Selena's lead, and I think I was inspired for both Selena and Deepa when we were preparing. My family comes from what is currently called Assam, in the eastern region of what is currently India. It was not India when my parents were born. They were born as subjects of the British Empire. And certainly the thing that is called Assam is so heterogeneous, we don't have time to talk about it. So I use this name for myself, even though I've grown up outside of Assam. My parents immigrated to the United States, and I grew up on the banks of the Mississippi River um, with the Ozark and Potawatomi and Haudenosaunee people who had been removed successfully, unfortunately, at the time that I lived there as an uninvited settler. And through various meandering paths, made my way to Toronto, where I'm very grateful to work and live and learn, and very inspired by the efforts to have an economy of gratitude that many Indigenous scholars are bringing into this space, the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabeg, peoples here in Wendat, the Seneca. It's something I'm learning very humbly. What does that look like? My own entry point into this work is through feminist organizing when I was a college student. And I had an opportunity to attend training. I had volunteered in a child abuse hotline. I was like 19. I was living in Atlanta. And it was the first time I found the language to understand my own family violence experiences. Grew up in a family with a lot of strife, a lot of verbal abuse, psychological terror. And it's been a wonderful journey to understand that and then find language to meet with other people. So it really was a space where I felt empowerment to, in very feminist spaces, speak out against the things I was witnessing on campus, forms of sexual assault, sexual harassment, things I was experiencing myself. I also experienced a lot of harm in gender violence movements because they were very much white, heteronormative spaces. And it took me more years to unpack some of the colonial underpinnings within feminist thinking. And some of that was from my work in the United States, as well as working with refugees briefly in France, working very humbly and not very effectively as a development person, worker in Thailand, and then also working briefly in the Navajo Nation. This is where I really started to unpack and unlearn a lot of the things I had learned as an American. American imperialism was like in my body, even if I didn't want it to be. And so I think I'm still in that process and have started only now in my 50s to think about the intergenerational knowledge that I have from my mother and the grandmother I never met, the aunties who are still with me and those who have passed, parenting and aunting my niece. All the feminist troublemakers in my lives of various genders have really motivated me. So I really come to this through my own sense of pain and anger and sense of despair. And also that feeling of strength when we come together to create that sense of critical hope. And as my mother always said, to find joy in the simple pleasures. So I'm very grateful it's Friday and then it's sunny today where I am. And I hope that you all can also find some joy in the next few days. So to the next slide. Oh, wait, actually, if we could go back 1 second. This is just on the right. I went to the No Tyrants. Oh my God, the tyrants. So I am American too. And I think the political context is so important. And this is the hard part. How do we understand our current moment? When Selena was speaking earlier, and even Deepa, about different political events, my my work on immigration as a form of gender-based violence, immigration policy, really started in the months after 9/11. I was working and volunteering in a gender-based violence organization for South Asian women, Chaya, based in Seattle. And it was really my first time on coming to face with um, how little I knew about state violence as intertwined with intimate partner violence, domestic violence in the home. I think I knew this in the textbook level, but that was the first time I really saw, okay, people coming to us for support, afraid to call the police. We were afraid to recommend them to go to the police because people are being rounded up on security certificates as terrorists. Anyone who looked Arab or Muslim or South Asian, people who are being harassed on the buses, sound familiar? Feels like it's happening again and again. And we know these waves occur at different times, different groups are targeted. There's also incredible strength in communities, so I don't want to only take a deficit lens. So I just kind of that context piece. So we'll go to the next slide. I'm going to try to really add to that intersectional piece that Deepa was talking about. I love the work of Black feminists who really grounded us from their own lived experience, that our differences, as Audre Lorde wrote, this incredible poet, activist from the United States, it's not our differences that divide us. It's our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences. So I really want to think about this as an ethos. Like, how do we operate in that place of appreciation and curiosity? To the next slide, there's another incredible activist lawyer who I've learned from, Mari Matsuda, who is a queer lawyer of Asian descent in California, where I currently am. She wrote this quite many years ago, but I think this is really helpful. How do we practice intersectionality by asking the other question? So if we are paying attention to the racism, we should ask, where's the patriarchy in this? Or if we see something that looks sexist, where is the heterosexism in this? When we see something that looks homophobic or transphobic, where is the class interest here? And this is as much true within immigrant communities as it is across different lines of recognizable difference. Because so often culture in the Canadian context, and especially I teach in social work, culture is often invoked when we are imagining difference. When we think if there is a difference, then all of a sudden we worry about culture. Even if our worry is to be responsive to difference, sometimes we hone in on the things that are visible and maybe not looking at some of the class interest, heterosexist interest that might be cutting across what we might think of as cultural or ethnic differences. So I'll go to the next slide. The context of the work I'm doing, again, is looking at immigration, but in the context of gender-based violence and the child welfare system. This is fairly new for me, new meaning only in the last 4 or 5 years. I mostly have worked with adults who are women identified, who've been experiencing gender-based violence, and I've heard accounts of and have been involved with supporting them when child protective services are involved in their lives. I have never worked in the child protective system. I have been a mandated reporter earlier in my career. I still am technically, although I don't usually hear those accounts. So the system has always governed me, the child protective system, as someone who's a worker with people who are experiencing violence. We really, as a collective, are working with service providers, activists, folks with lived experience, thinking about the family policing aspect of these systems, as well as how they often fall short at protecting children's welfare or family welfare. We use more of an anti-racist structural lens versus a cultural competency lens because of the ways that a lot of nonprofits are often regulated. And what is competency in one context often is not taking into account some of the structural pieces, usually because we don't have the resources to do that well. And really inviting an abolition framework, although very much work is needed at the reform to make sure immediate needs are met now. But by abolition, we don't mean dismantling and destroying. Certainly, that's what fascists are doing all over the world right now. What we mean is rebuilding and thinking about alternatives that are more life-giving. That's what I think when I think of abolition. So go to the next slide. If you can click once more, one of the frameworks we're using for our practice, again, as I asked at the beginning, anti-cop border agent, is how does the border show up in our everyday lives? How does this idea of who belongs? What is a nation? The idea of a nation, as we see in wars fought around the world, is violent. You know, creating this space of a nation is beautiful in that we have a sense of identity and belonging, but that belonging is only possible because it's demarcating who doesn't belong. And the infrastructures for choosing who comes in, who comes out, who gets to have the full rights is our spaces of both administrative violence, bureaucratic violence, and material violence through detention, deportation, and possibly loss of life through family separation. So I want us to think about our own cultural assumptions about what is Canada. Is it a nation that gives life, protects human rights? Is it a place that protects some people's rights at the expense of others? And how does this border show up in your work, in your everyday conversations? Another key piece we want to look at is how are the policing aspects of the systems that we work within show up. A lot of times what we've seen, and this is the work of Selena Abji with another colleague, Heather Bergen, really looking at the linking of these carceral systems, the punishment from folks who may be involved in child protection, especially those who are youth, who because of their immigration status, if they are criminalized, they are subject to losing their right to remain in Canada. Because as a permanent resident, if you have certain criminal sentences beyond 6 months, your permanent residence is no longer valid. So this pipeline from child welfare to criminal justice to deportation is very real and also poses a threat for many families. I'll go to the next slide. So if we think about everyday bordering, this was the context of some of our work. We're going to move a little bit more quickly because I want to show a couple examples. So the research questions that our project came up with, keep going to 1, 2, 3. My colleague Mandeep Kormasina, who's operating in Victoria, who also worked many times, and some of you may know, she was in Toronto for a while. She was at Thorncliffe Neighborhood Office many years ago when we were doing work, and then also was doing work in Halifax. We were trying to ask, how does the process of assessing child abuse risk for neglect reproduce internal borders? What forms of everyday bordering are taking place in this family regulation system, especially the dual mandate of protecting children, but also ensuring their welfare? And then what about these carceral logics, these forms of punishments that get intertwined through the process of caring for children with precarious status and their families? So next slide. I won't go into this, but we've been doing a lot of things the last few years, looking at policy documents, observing workshops, talking to people working in and out of systems. We're currently doing data collection with folks, parents and families. So I may share in the chat later because we are recruiting parents and youth parents and caregivers who've been involved in child protection with a precarious status. I will say that one of the challenges of doing this work is a lot of policies around child welfare across Canada don't even use the word immigrant in the policy. So when we think about not knowing, and this is something that has come up, and I'll go to the next slide here, the kind of silos and silences around these different intersectional pieces has been one of the biggest challenges of the bordering work. I don't think I have to remind you all, but Canada is a place that has a lot of people who immigrated here. So when we say immigrant, we are also often talking about people racialized as non-white. They come from hundreds of different countries, speak so many different languages. I was just looking up while Selena and Deepa were talking in Toronto, and some of these statistics are really hard to calculate. An estimate of 50% of people in the GTA don't speak English at home. That's pretty profound. So that means their daily lives, they're making sense of their lives, not only in English or French, but in other languages. And that up to 1 in 20 can't speak English or French fluently. This is from an older study that Social Planning Toronto did in 2018. So it might be much older and different now. And also that 60% of those who aren't speaking English fluently or French, although we know there's not that much French language access in Toronto, are women and girls. And up to 40% of these are over 65. I'm sure you all see this in your work, but even when we think about language, it's not just about the fluency around English and French. It's also how can we talk about these concepts in ways that are respectful, especially if we're relying on interpreters who may not have the same values or approach or training around gender-based violence as the spaces where you all work. So go to the next slide, please. When we think about the intervention with child protection, some of you may have seen this in your work or maybe in media. Only in the last 15 years has there's been an open dialogue about how much racism is operating within child welfare. I say that because even before 2010, many of the children's aid societies in the Toronto region were not publishing their data, or maybe they did not have data to even think about overrepresentation. We know there's incredible work that's been happening led by Indigenous communities to hold federal government and provincial governments account because of the harms and cultural genocide with Indigenous communities. There's also incredible work led by African, Caribbean, and Black communities in the Toronto, GTA, Ontario area, not as much across Canada, but it is happening. The rates of intervention are still really, really high. So overrepresentation, meaning that if we look at the representation of the population, of folks who identify as Black or Latino or newcomer, they are much higher for those who have child protection services involved in their lives. So this is one of the challenges. And once those systems are in their lives, the carceral pipeline can trigger all other consequences, including potential deportation and permanent family separation through deportation. Next slide, please. So one of the things we were doing, we're talking to folks working in child protection, service providers like yourselves who work with immigrants who've been involved in child protection. There are so many different types of precarious status, and these are not linear categories. They change, they're morph. People don't always understand their status in the same family. People can have different statuses or it changes. You all know these policies change rapidly, especially with the politics right now of our current liberal government, which seems to be echoing, perhaps in a more Canadian way, meaning it's softer, some of the very fundamental deprivation of rights that's happening in the United States. So whether it's someone with a temporary permit to study or work, or as a dependent on their spouse, maybe there's a family sponsorship breakdown, folks waiting for refugee claims. There's so many different types of statuses, and part of the learning curve in your organizations might be, how do we stay abreast of these changes? Who are the people that we can rely on to stay on top of this? Go to the next slide, please. So when we were observing trainings like this and going to different workshops around gender-based violence, around immigration access, going to trainings around child protection, seeing how child protection workers were trained, we often saw really deep knowledge in one area of this intersectionality and often gaps and misinformation in others. So when talking in spaces around gender-based violence with immigrants, with folks of various identities, we often saw people were hesitant or did not even mention children. And we wondered about that. What is it that a conversation that's trying to improve access around gender-based violence services does not include? What if those adults have children in their lives? Or when we're talking with child protection workers looking at anti-racism and trying to unpack systemic racism, what does it mean if they're not including attention to immigration status, which was often the case? So if we go to the next slide, we started to lean on some incredible theory that comes out of different academic spaces. I'm a nerd, so I read this stuff. And how racism, sorry, my new computer is like doing things. I don't know how to stop it. How does form of ignorance, of not knowing, reproduce racism? The very, jargony word is epistemic injustice. Epistemic meaning, how do we come to know things? What makes them knowable? That's a simple way of saying it. And then Jose Medina, whose work I'm very inspired by, writes that ignorance can interfere with how we make meaning of and understand what individuals and groups are experiencing. We see that at huge scales, at wars and genocide happening in Gaza, in Sudan. They felt just lack of knowledge and understanding and misunderstanding, leading to more conflict. So I really want us to think about, beyond language interpretation, is also, what is the lack of knowledge that we may bring to our conversations about gender-based violence or supporting survivors? Go to the next slide. Jose Medina kind of breaks this down. There may be forms of ignorance that are passive. So it could be the absence of true belief, right? No, Canada is a place that protects people's human rights. This is what brings people here, often from around the world. Or maybe there's a presence of a false belief that our justice systems are working, or that the child welfare system is there to protect children only. I mean, it is there in a way to protect children, but it also has often been demonstrated to police Black, Indigenous, and poor families. There's also forms of active ignorance, either cognitive resistance, a prejudice, a conceptual lacuna that we can't get out of, maybe because of our own biases. Affective resistance, maybe we're exhausted, we're tired, we're under-resourced, we don't have, our own lives are chaotic. There might be bodily resistance, defensive mechanisms. So we think of ignorance as operating in lots of different scales. I'm going to move on and then stop. Let's see, a couple slides. Go to the next slide. Keep going, next slide. Keep going, next slide. So one of the things that this is perfect. Oh, go back one. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So one of the ways we're trying to imagine, we're still in the process of doing this, we're not finished, the analysis work. How does this bordering work show up in every day through these kinds of ignorances? One is how a voluntary agreement is perceived. This is often an agreement where there may not be an immediate child protection concern, but a family or caregiver or youth is offered to sign voluntarily an agreement to stay in relationship with child protection. We saw this happen in our conversations where people gave accounts where sometimes this is the only way a parent or family who has no status could get access to essential services like food or housing or healthcare. What does it mean when the only way you can get access to these services is to stay in a one-year relationship with child protection, where they still are monitoring. Are you parenting well? And could still intervene if they feel like what you're doing is not meeting certain standards. We also saw bordering happening in the assessment of unaccompanied youth and minors who they arrive at the airport, child protection services are called to figure out how to support this youth. And then in the process of assessing this youth's needs, the workers are also judging the age. Like, are they really old enough to be a minor? Or maybe their behavior, maybe they're acting in a way that makes their claim of a refugee seem fraudulent. So now their assessment for child protection needs turns into assessment of immigration validity, right? Like, are they really here as a refugee? So I'm going to keep like echoing in the last slide. Some of my colleagues have already said, if you can go to the next slide, please. There's so much more that I can't unpack in this brief presentation. But when we think about the border, your own roles, to what extent are you showing up as that auntie? To what extent are you showing up as that cop? Are you worried about, are people parenting correctly when you're supporting them, especially people experiencing gender-based violence? How are you potentially arriving at assumptions about the well-being of the children in that family? Maybe how does the duty to report culture in your organization shape how you respond to cases like this? And also assumptions about who is illegal, who's legally present. Are they deserving of being in Canada? This can be very hard, especially because people who are undocumented require a lot more resources from our organizations, the nonprofits that are poorly funded, because they're excluded from social safety nets. So I'm going to stop here because we have used up a lot of our time. Thank you all, and I look forward to the questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your work and your knowledge with us today. I really liked how you brought up the idea of the same systems that are sometimes meant to protect us are also sometimes the ones that end up policing and bordering us. So I think it was a lovely presentation. So thank you so much. We'll now transition into our panel discussion, where we'll have an opportunity to explore some of these themes in more depth. I'll be posing a few questions to our panelists, questions that draw from their research, frontline experience, and advocacy work. And as we go along, I encourage everyone in the audience to share your reflections in the chat box or in the Q&A, and we'll try our best to address some of them in the Q&A portion towards the end. I know we're a little bit short on time, but we'll try our best to get as many as possible. To our speakers, please feel free to jump in as you feel inspired. So my first question that I have is, many of your presentations have touched on intersectionality. Are there any other ways that intersecting identities shape immigrant women's experiences of gender-based violence or their engagement with services? And to follow along with that question, what type of intersections should we be thinking about?
I can attempt first from my experience of, of working with clients. So, and I kind of alluded to it in my intervention. I think what is really important is to understand and honor the fact that you probably don't even know all the intersections, because you need to listen very carefully to the person's experience. But these intersections are at very many levels. It could be in her own personal history of who she is and where she comes from. But these intersections could be also, which we understand more in our intake process demographically, her age, her time in the country, the status of the country currently, the status she's trying to get to, who she's dependent on. And then many other things. But something that I find really dangerous is to think about intersections of identity as the root cause of the experience of violence. I think that's where my fear of where the explanation of intersectionality goes. At times when people are talking about it, that's where my fear sits. Because when we understand the concept of intersectionality, you need to understand that this is rooted both in someone's identity, but in their experiences. But the barrier that they face on a day-to-day basis, navigating this complexity, is not because of their intersectionality. That is because people have designed the programs and the policies and the processes that have not accounted for all of that complex layered intersections. As long as we can be clear on that piece, I don't think we all need to understand all the possible intersections, because I'll give you my own very personal example. I am supposedly from India, right? But actually, my family is from Kashmir. I've never lived in Kashmir, though, but I call myself Kashmiri. I am an immigrant woman, but I'm married to a Punjabi. So I understand more about Punjabi culture. I speak 5 different languages. I'm also a mother. I'm a lawyer. I'm an executive director. And I have a woman as my daughter who also is a feminist, but at times thinks that I don't speak my English properly. So tell me what identity I have. I have 5 degrees, but she thinks my English is not enough. So I always question people that understand that there is a lot to unpack when you think of people's identities, and language access is needed. So please, let's not also walk away from today's presentation that right to language is anything any less, right? And people don't need cultural brokers for their culture to be understood. I think what is needed is that people to actually acknowledge, I don't know enough, I haven't left this country, maybe I haven't, or if you have traveled somewhere for 1 week, you haven't understood the culture of that place. That humility that is needed, I think, is what I am calling for. Thank you. And I'm sorry, I get very passionate. I've been working on it.
What do you
Eva,
mean you're
that
working
answer
on
was
it?
fire. That was fire. Thank you. And I will also, I just want to like support you in that. I think also from like when people use statistics or when they talk about, oh, this community is disproportionately affected by gender-based violence, but then they pause there and they don't explain that that's because of systemic vulnerabilities to violence, it's barriers to service. It's not because those communities are inherently violent. So I think we have to be careful when we use that language as well to like finish the sentence, finish the thought, because if we leave it, people fill in the blanks in ways that draw from a lot of cultural assumptions or other assumptions. Um, and maybe I'll just add, if you don't mind, Nahid, to answer your question as well. I think one thing that is a very technical thing that in our immigration system that I think we should be paying attention to as an intersection is birthright citizenship. So that's something that I've seen the right-wing parties in Canada, and this is happening elsewhere as well, kind of hint at or try to introduce legislation or modify legislation to take away birthright citizenship for people who are here temporarily. Basically, very quickly, if you are born on Canadian soil, you have access to citizenship. You're automatically a citizen. And so the strategy here is to scapegoat migrants, to really play into people's fears about bogus migrants or birth tourism, sometimes is the language that is used. The idea that people are just coming here temporarily and trying to have babies to get into Canada and Canadian citizenship, which we know statistically is not and anywhere near the kind of concerns that, you know, there's a lot of stoking of fires there. And I think that's something that, because it's so technical, maybe we don't always know about it or know how to fight against that. But I definitely see that coming down the pipeline as well. And I think that's an intersection that in terms of our advocacy, we need to be thinking about because there are a lot of people here who are temporary or not permanent residents as well. So I wanted to throw that in.
I think it's very powerful to hear how different identities intersect in shaping these experiences, especially within the practices that we have, especially with non-for-profit practices and a lot of frontline service practices. But I do want to move on to the next question. Building on this question is, can you elaborate on what it means to be culturally responsive in terms of everything that we have been discussing so far? And what are some of the strategies that you have found effective in building trust and establishing cultural safety within immigrant communities in terms of GBV programming?
Yeah, and I might add, and I'd love to hear what Selena and Deepa are going to say, because I'm thinking about just even language access first. So I think that intersectional lens, I think of it as both what are the capacity, right, to find ways to communicate with people who may have, there may be a barrier in communication, right, between whoever's offering the services and the language of people seeking it. Sometimes that's facilitated by calling a language hotline. Oftentimes it's using people in the family. And I really want to encourage folks to apply that power lens, right? Like, to what extent is someone experiencing stigma and maybe even coercive control within their language communities that then can shape how they seek help? Those larger language groups, we have more resources. So I really worry about people. Like, there are not very many Assamese speakers. I'm also not a fluent Assamese speaker in Ontario. I I can't even imagine someone who's Assamese wanting to get an Assamese interpreter who also lives, because the minute you call that person, a million people back home will find out what happened. This is the joke we say: if you know one Assamese and you tell them a million, because that's the way communication is spread within the community. So I think that the concerns around language access are very real. Who are we relying on? Have the people been vetted? And do they understand domestic violence in a way that's not going to re-stigmatize people? Do they understand not just domestic violence, period, or gender-based violence, but violence that might be experienced because of people's sexual orientation or gender orientation, intersections with ability or disability? And as I said earlier, perceptions around legality or illegality if someone doesn't have immigration status. So I think that the training that is needed to keep those relationships going, and ensuring there's going to be respectful spaces is really important. Um, this is where that duty to report piece comes in. I don't know what's happening in all the organizations, but another colleague, Selena, and I work with, Heather Bergen, has been really looking at how professionals' fear of getting in trouble, also the fear of, a child being harmed, of course, but fear of getting in trouble if they don't report. What does that do if it kind of shuts down conversation? So when we were meeting with immigrant settlement service providers, we were hearing people saying, well, we try not to talk about it, right? Because they don't want to have to report. So it kind of puts a chilling effect on really important conversations. So that's another part of intersectionality I invite us to think about, is not just what we know or don't know, but like, what are we worried about if we have the conversation openly? So I'd love to hear maybe deeper, Selena.
Just on the duty to report, Rupali, I'm happy to share what the clinic does. We have limits of confidentiality that is read out to every client who calls at the clinic. And that's what we take pride in, doing our services from a very deep trauma-informed lens. And giving people alternate options, from speaking to social workers to speaking to lawyers directly. And I know that we have that advantage because we are a mixed modality, and both modalities have a very different duty to report. But happy to talk to you more about that. And I think this easy answer is they should talk to a lawyer instead of talking to a social worker. But it's a deeper, nuanced conversation. I don't want people to misunderstand what I'm saying, but happy to have a side conversation about that. Very quickly, the language access piece that Rupalim is talking about, and because the clinic provides interpretation services, I want to tell you that the people who are trained to be interpreters at the clinic, many of them are survivors themselves. All of them are immigrants and refugees themselves. So we also need to understand that language as a right and the access of language as a right with the same group of people who are also working with the same group of people, once they are trained and they understand confidentiality, they understand the ethics, and they go through that whole exercise, the experience is very different as compared to me trying to interpret for someone without having that training and just stepping in. Because there is also vicarious trauma in interpretation that people don't understand. When you get exposed to someone's trauma and you are, literally speaking out the same thing that the other person is explaining, you are literally living that story in your body, and you need to be trained in how to navigate. But I think hire people from diverse backgrounds if you want to be culturally sensitive. Engage in language interpretation in a meaningful way, not through help of family members and community members. Provide your services in multiple languages, Engage with the community leaders, engage with the religious leaders and faith leaders. If you really want to be meaningfully engaging and be culturally responsive, then take some accountability of your own connections to the community and provide flexibility in your service models. Your service models can't be you come to us alone. As I said earlier, you need to go in the community and provide services if you want to be responsive. And don't think you're doing this alone. There is many people doing this work. So try to understand who they are, who the experts are, and work with them. I really do not appreciate when a lot of agencies get very isolated and say, we are doing it all by ourselves. No one else is doing this work. That is not really true. There is always someone else doing this work. You just to seek out and find and connect with them.
I think these are very important points, especially trust and cultural safety. They really sit at the heart of a lot of the work that, IWIN does, as well as the panelists, the work that you do as well. I think cultural safety is a really, really big portion. But to end off on this note, thank you so much to all our speakers and everyone who joined us today. We had such a rich and insightful conversation. I definitely had enjoyed it. But unfortunately, we actually have run out of time for the Q&A session. If you have any questions or you would like to connect with any of our speakers, please feel free to email us at comms@iwinca.ca. I have written the email in our chat box. We'll do our best to get back to you as soon as possible or connect you accordingly with one of our speakers. Thank you so much for being part of this important conversation. And I hope that this webinar will continue to inspire and allow everyone to reflect and commit action in your communities. But have a lovely weekend, and we hope to see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.